Welcome everyone to SQL Friday. This is number 32 already. First of all, apologize for not finishing the video from last week's SQL Friday. So I've got both Jovan Popovic and Bob Duffy to do this weekend to do the editing and rendering. It'll be uploaded. I'll make sure it comes on Twitter so you can all see it. But enough of that. Welcome Bob Duffy, who is our star today, who is going to talk about financial modeling in Power BI. Bob is connecting from Ireland, so same time zone as more or less as us or as me this time. We have had everything from Texas to, I think, like a bit further away than India. So we've had basically all the time zones in the world. This one is a bit more convenient. I know the guys, Mike, who connected from Texas, he stood up 4 a.m. to get ready. So this is noon for us. But welcome, Bob. The stage is yours. Just take over.
Thank you. I will share my screen. There you go. You should see an empty desktop, and I will start my presentation. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. Yeah, I can see down on Teams. Right. So welcome everyone. And I was saying I'm going to be presenting on financial modeling with Power BI. Right. I'm just going to see if I can get the Teams chat up on one of my screens. I'm just going to bring that up on one of the screens. There we go. Right. If you have any questions, if you drop them in the chat, kind of while I'm kind of talking, and Magnus will sort of poke me right at a appropriate point. I'm more than happy to pause and discuss any of the aspects, as long as it's kind of related to your financial modeling, right? So this is what I'm going to be talking about. I'll do a brief intro. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bob Duffy. I've been around the sort of database sector a long time. I'm one of what used to be called the kind of SQL Rangers, or the certified architects on the SQL platform. Also an MCM, an MVP, and analysis services maestro. All of that is probably irrelevant to this particular talk. What probably is kind of relevant is I do have a degree in accountancy, and I've spent kind of most of my life developing systems to help accountants kind of analyze data and report on that sort of data. So I'm talking about more reporting. So when I say modeling, I don't mean financial modeling as in a sort of what if analysis. I mean modeling as in sort of data modeling. How do you design the kind of data models in sort of Power BI to work with financial reports? So there's my blog. Oh, with the URL has changed, but never mind. If you just sort of Google sort of Bob Duffy blog, I'm sure you find it. And you can email me if you have any questions, or if you want a copy of anything that I haven't provided there. I did drop a link in the chat to the PBIX, so you can quite happily steal any ideas and reverse engineer it and stick your logo if you think it's any good, right? Work away. So this is what we're going to cover in. So I'll just start off by introducing like what I call financial reporting and modeling, and I'm going to go through 7 challenges that you have if you're working with general ledger data. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be going through over the next hour, right? I'm not talking on fancy visualization, so I'm not talking about how to take your profit and loss, and this is perhaps the biggest mistake that BI professionals make. They say, yeah, financial accountants have this profit and loss format that's in this pro forma regulatory standard. I'm going to do away with that and give you a spinning logo instead, and a waterfall chart. No, right? Absolutely not. Right? You have to give them the regulatory reports before you get started and all the fancy stuff. Do all the fancy stuff afterwards, but we've got to get the core financial structure right first, right? So that's what I'm kind of mainly focused on, right? So what is financial reporting? Well, typically an ERP or a finance system will be split into lots of modules, right? And you'll probably hear these acronyms are not. GL, AP, AR, and stock are 4 common ones that I work on, right? What we're going to focus on is probably the heart of any financial system, GL, the general ledger. So what will happen within an ERP is they'll have their sales module, their order processing, their stock control. These modules will go through a posting process at the end of the month typically to post an aggregated value into the general ledger that then goes into the profit and loss of the balance sheet or whatever, right? So that's what your general ledger is, right? So obviously we're going to focus on that. There's typically a holy trinity, as I call it, of reports that come out of the general ledger. Your profit and loss, or if you're a Yank, the income statement, right? Balance sheet, and cash flow, right? If you can get those three perfect, then you're sort of doing well, and you'll have happy. Well, some of the finance team will be happy, but certainly these are the types of reports in some shape or form that will form a lot of content in, for example, the board pack that the exec teams are going to be looking at. You can't really look at cash flow until you fully implemented all the other two, because it takes elements from those. Now, there's a later talk I have where we dive into example cash flows, but for this one we're just going to really focus on sort of profit and loss and balance sheet, which are very similar beasts, right? So on the right side of the screen here, the first thing is you land on a project and the financial team says, we want you to do a BI version of the profit and loss. I guess the first question is why? Like, that doesn't your accounts package print a profit and loss for you, right? In some cases it does, right? So we use QuickBooks, you know, I just hit a button, I get a profit and loss. I'm never going to make a BI report for that, right? But at the massive enterprise level, it's very common for the ERPs, you know, to not have the nuance of how they want to present their profit and loss to the management for analyzing data. You know, some ERPs do. Some ERPs have expensive BI modules that they haven't bought, and they've decided to use the Microsoft stack and instead say SAP would be one, right? So so let's have a look, right? The requirements here on the right, you have the kind of postings are aggregate into 2-level and single-level hierarchies, right? So it's kind of a ragged hierarchy, as well as your rolled up measures. The accountants will typically put these calculations, right, and KPIs on the report itself. Some of them you can see as a subtotal, right? So that's kind of a custom aggregate. Net invoice sales is equal to effectively gross sales minus discounts, right? So they're typically, accountants always work backwards for some reason. So they say, well, that is gross sales minus discounts, right? Which is really annoying because no one likes making a report working backwards. We like to work forwards, right? So generally we switch the requirements to forwards, in that you could kind of see that net invoice sales, if it's gross sales minus discounts, it's a running sum, right? So we'll probably think of that as a running sum rather than as the requirements are expressed. And all of these groupings on the report are typically ranges of general ledger or account codes. So when the posting is made, there be a general ledger code. For example, 4130 to 4139 could be returns and adjustments, and there'd be lots of individual accounts in there. Okay, so this is what your requirements are. At the bottom of the report, you might have some kind of, you could see them as KPIs. For example, EBITDA or EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, and amortization, right? So this is probably a more important metric than profit after tax for any company, right? Because you've got certain degrees of money that you make, like interest, that are largely relevant to how your business is run. Imagine that Magnus was super rich and his company had bought a load of buildings and they rented them out, but that wasn't his core business. His core business is software consultants. His rental income made him €1 million a year, and his software company lost $500,000 a year. I mean, he could look at his profit and say, hey, I'm making $500,000 a year, I'm doing really well, right? But his core business, you know, not doing so well, right? So you kind of want to take off that interest because it's not your core business. So EBITDA, a lot of analysts that I talk to, is one of the only metrics they're looking. So that's probably got to go on the profit and loss there, right? And you can kind of see that's probably a running sum, right? The same as all the others, actually, right? It could be seen as a running sum because it's basically everything up until that point. And this is where you hear financial accountants talking about above the line and below the line, right? So anything below EBITDA is below the EBITDA line on the report, basically. Right, so let's kind of look at the challenges to make this exact report. Now the other thing is pro forma, which I'll talk about. The accountants say, I want it in this format. The junior BI consultant usually starts arguing with them, say, well, wouldn't it be a better idea to put this over there and that over there? No, right? Financial accountants have spent months and years arguing over what goes what on what line, and whether something is depreciation or an operating expense or something like that. And you're not going to be changing the structure of what they want. So your job is to give them what they want, and if you want to get them to do more analytics, go from there, right? So let's look at the first problem, the chart of accounts, right? So what I've done is I've taken AdventureWorks, right? Within AdventureWorks, there is actually a general ledger. So there's actually a fact table called fact transactions, and you can suck that up into Power BI. And it's, it's not exactly the same as an ERP, but it gives you a good idea of what a general ledger looks like, right? So that's exactly what I've done. So a starting point is what I call a naive kind of model. I go into the tables that are presented by the ERP, in this case, AdventureWorks, and just use the wizard in Power BI to bring them in, and you end up with this type of star schema kind of model, right? Most ERPs have very flexible general ledger systems where the dimensionality is done as part of the design and fit of the ERP. So someone could have the same ERP, but different customers will have different dimensions depending on the industry they're in, right? So for example, in banking, they might have a customer group and customer as a dimension. In manufacturing, they're going to have sort of a product group, plant, and other dimensions are going to be linked into the general ledger, but some way of aggregating up the values to some sort of level. So here in AdventureWorks, we just have 5 dimensions here, right? And if you were to query it, it would look like this, right? Now, AdventureWorks is kind of unique. There's not too many ERPs that render it as parent-child, right? And this is one of the biggest mistakes that probably people make is looking at the AdventureWorks. You can see, because it's parent-child, you're like, hey, I've got a hierarchy. And it's kind of, one of the hierarchies is called sort of balance sheet, and one is called profit and loss. So I can use that hierarchy for my reporting purposes, right? No, probably not, right? And I'll show you why, right? But it's certainly a good starting point. So what you'll see is some detail is rolled up into parent account code. So if I look at parent account code 3, cash, I can see the ones that have a parent of 3 is current assets is account key 3, cash and receivables, allowance for bad debt and inventory are all under that parent. So that's your hierarchy, right? Now, as I said before, typically you have these 4 to 6 digit GL codes, and you'll see a pattern there where everything that starts with a 10 is an asset, say, for example. So I kind of think of them like IP4 ranges, right? So if a network engineer is making a large network, he'll have, well, this kind of subnet is that building, this subnet is that country, or something like that, right? So it's the same in accounts, right? You'll generally have a range of numbers will match a certain part of the balance sheet or the profit and loss. So let's do a basic model. So I've taken AdventureWorks and I've just naively just gone sort of next, and the only work I've done is a little bit of DAX work to flatten or normalize the hierarchy, as to call it in BI, to give this kind of level 1, 2, 3, 4, and it actually goes to level 6 is actually its highest. So there are functions kind of built into DAX for that, right? And I will show a demo of that, right? So here I have boom. So if I go into transform data, I've literally just gone add table, add table, add table, and you'll see the only cleanup I've done is I've removed a few columns that I haven't needed. I might have renamed a few columns to add spaces where it's important, but I haven't done any major transformation work. And what I'll end up with is exactly what's in the diagram here. I might have added all the joins maybe. So the only work I've done to get this far would be on the calculated columns, right? So you see here, so it's not, I've added account path with the path function to just draw the parent child. So I can now see what its parents and its parents are. And I've manually added level 1 actually does have a name because this would be the report name. So either balance sheet and so forth. And then level 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is using the path item function. Now this how to handle parent child is well sort of documented like on the DAX patterns websites and stuff like that. So if you do have a parent child, you can go away and look at that. But that's how you flatten it, and then you render that as a hierarchy, and then effectively you can, using the kind of matrix type view, you can have your hierarchy here, which is the first stab, right? Now there's a few things that you'll notice immediately, like because it's a hierarchy, the ragged hierarchy aspect makes it look very ugly. Like you see here, cash, I don't have a level 5 and 6 on cash. If I go to tax, you know, this to me would seem very unprofessional. If someone gave me a report that kind of looked like that, I'd be like, whoa, you know, was this a senior guy who made this, you know? So let's look at some of the problems of the of our very first attempt, right? Signage is probably the major thing, right? Within your general ledger, you're going to have sort of assets and liabilities, and most ERPs would store them internally as positives because it would say, well, it's a positive kind of liability, right? But this means that if you just copy all of the data out into a data model, you're not going to be able to get your profit automatically calculate. As example here, the basic model, I've got 1.6 million in sales and 743 in expenses. So clearly, even schoolboy math, my sort of profit should be sales minus expenses, but it's actually added it on. So it's completely incorrect. So you're going to have to make sure that your expenses are kind of treated as a negative. And there's basically two ways of doing that. You could do that in DAX. So use like an if kind of statement and say, well, if the asset type is an expense, then, you know, times it by -1. I wouldn't terribly recommend that. I'd recommend pushing that down to the storage engine, right? So either do it in M as part of the Power Query if you're 100% Power BI. If you have the luxury of having a data warehouse underneath it, then as your ETL brings it into the kind of data warehouse, it can transform it by just kind of flipping that sign. So as an example, here's some M code that as it comes in, rather than simply rename, I'm saying if the account type equals expenditures, then multiply by -1, else just kind of multiply by 1. So I'm kind of adding a custom column that gives me the base amount. And once I do that, I now get the correct kind of figures, right? So that's kind of an easy one, right? I mean, everyone has to deal with that, right? Ragged hierarchies become a little bit more complex. If you've got, even in the sample they gave, there were 2 levels, if you remember, and some of them were just 1 level, like, for example, a KPI is only 1 kind of level, it's not a hierarchy, and others were sort of 2 levels. In AdventureWorks, it's a 6-level hierarchy, and it just looks absolutely awful, right? So there is a blog there from the DAX patterns on how to deal with that. I can show you a demo of that in action, right? If we do a tidied up version, if you go to the hierarchy, you can use this function here, path lengths, to determine what depth a particular entry goes to, right? So this one is a 5 level item. This one is 2, so it's quite a top kind of level item, right? And then the bit that you're then kind of missing is what level it is currently visible on the report. And this is where, was it 2 years ago or so, a new function came in called is in scope. So we can say, is that particular level of the hierarchy in the current scope of the report? So just to show you that, What I typically do is I add like a hidden, I'll add a measure that I hide is in scope. Now, I haven't kind of hidden this because it's just for sort of debug purposes. So what I'm doing is say, what is the current scope of what is shown on the report, right? Is in scope 6, so as a switch statement, are we at level 6? Are we at level 5? Are we at level 5? Are we at level 4, 3, 2, 1, or whatever, right? So what this gives me when I drag this onto the matrix is an understanding as to what scope an individual line on the report is. If I compare that to the maximum available depth, I can say if the current scope is lower than the max available depth, it's not valid. Hide it, right? And the easy way to hide something in a tabular model is to multiply it by null, right? Because you get the kind of non-empty behavior, right? So effectively, that's what we do, right? So there's this hide account. If the account scope is less than the account depth, I get a 1, and that implies else null, right? So I just multiply. So when I show my general ledger, I multiply that. I'm just going to take off that stupid sorry, that fields. I'm going to take off the account scope because that renders it. And that then gives me this nicer behavior where when I click on taxes, it doesn't expand. Now, because this report isn't really intended for drill down, you know, I'd really use drill through on a profit and loss. You're not expecting anyone to hide and show things, so you probably get rid of the plus and the minus. So you can just go into the row headers and get rid of the plus and minus. That's probably a complaint in the Power BI team. Billions of euro probably invested in a sort of data viz, and this is the best plus and minus that they came up with. Anyway, that's how I'd probably render that. So that's a ragged hierarchy, right? And you can read more on our friends, the Italians. Shout out to Marco and Alberto there, have some good blogs on those sort of patterns. Now let's talk about the pro forma layout, because this business of, so if you remember, I said the natural roll up that's presented in the benchworks isn't going to work, right? And the reason it's not going to work is because you look at what the accountants gave us, they've got these subtotals, these which are sort of a custom aggregate, they've got these running sums, and they've got these KPIs, and they want that to be part of the report. Your natural data in your parent child isn't going to have these calculated members in there, right? So all you'll get is the basic is a very basic value without any of these things in yellow, well, and without any of the subtotals, right? So how do we get all of these calculations in here? Well, we're going to need to create a data table that stores the rows of the report, okay? So this is one of the key things about any financial report, is the measures are always stored in rows, right? Whereas if you were to look at a sales model, sales would obviously be a measure, it'd be a column, right? But here, everything has got to be stored in rows, including our calculations, okay? So that's what we need to do, all right? Now, there's two ways of doing this. You could create a disconnected table, and you could key in all of the rows and then use something like a calculation group. I see a few talks on the internet about using calculation group, or in the old kind of MOLAP days, you know, I'm showing my age and I brought up on MOLAP, we would use scoped assignments to overwrite values of kind of dimension with these calculations here, right? Now you could do that, and there's nothing wrong. There are production systems. I'm going to show you some different thinking on that, right? Which is to use data modeling to do these types of calculations. So no calculation groups, no DAX, nothing like that. So the first thing that we need is we need a table to soft code the report. So what I do is I take all of the lines of the report, and so there'd be a line number. This should really say line number, but it says report number. That's just what the accountants call. That's just what the accountants called it. So I've just soft coded the entire profit and loss here, just in a spreadsheet even, right? You know, and what the report heading. So this is level 1, and that's kind of level 2. And then we give it a metadata driven operator. Is it a sum? So it's a natural roll up that would be satisfied by a parent child, or is it a running sum, in which case it's a calculation of the sum of the previous ones, or is it a custom calculation? So cost of sales, for example, is that one plus that one. So I model it by saying use the calc1 operator, and calc1 is a column, right? Just so we can get it. In that way, I can define as many financial reports as I want. I can have a P&L1. And when we chat later on, we might chat about report variation. I can have a P&L1 and a P&L2, because different divisions within a company could have a different profit and loss. And I'll show you an example of that kind of later on. So that's our starting point. We then need to say what account codes or what general ledger codes fit in each of these report headings, right? Because this kind of table might exist in the ERP. I have a lot of customers where this reporting structure is outside of the ERP. The financial accountants keep it in a spreadsheet or something like that. It's similar to what's in the ERP, but it might not have the calculations and the KPIs. So what I do is I create this map table, right, which says entry number 1 is these account ranges, and this information generally kind of is stored in the ERP. So hopefully you can almost suck it out, with the exceptions of kind of running sums and stuff like that. So that's how we map the chart of accounts that has the account code or the GL code to the reporting structure. We say it's from here to here. Note, we don't list all the account codes because an accounts chart of accounts is dynamic. Accountants can add a new general ledger. They could buy a new division and say, well, I'm going to add a new general ledger code, right? What we're doing is designing a structure so that when they put new general ledger codes, as long as they put it within that range, so I'll show one that's got a range, returns and adjustments of 4130 to 4139. So if they had a new account code, it should slot in that range, right? You always get kind of messy stuff, like administration is like this code or this code or this code, and they're not in a range, right? Or they define a perfect range of 100 codes, and then they need 101 entries in there. So they have to open up a new range, right? And that's fine. You just have multiple rows in there for the peculiarities. It's never going to be a perfect system where there's one band per line on the report, right? And then we need to expand this so that we get a many to many. Okay, now I'll show you an example of the expansion, right? Think of a simple profit and loss with 5 lines on it. So that's the second table here. I have 2 types of sales, customer and trade, and then I have a running sum for my sales total. I have expenses, and then I have a running sum at the bottom. So I've got 5 lines on my report, but only 3 are physical and 2 are calculated, right? And I've got 4 accounts or four entries from my chart of accounts to fit on the report. My mapping table says that line 1, which is customer sales, is from account code 1120 to 120. So that would just be the first 2 fit into customer sales. Okay, trade sales would be the second line, which I can see from here, and expenses is probably there, right? That we need some logic to then create this table, right? So it says line 1 on the report is account keys 1, but it's also account key 2. Line 2 is just 3. Now this is where it gets interesting. The running sum, which is 3, is equal to 1, 2, and 3, because it's effectively all of them summed up. So I'm not using any DAX for equal sum or anything like that. I'm using the many to render that running sum, okay? And once I get that many to many's table, I can join my chart of accounts onto my reporting dimension that has all my like KPIs and calculated members. I can join it on by using a many to many. Now, obviously, a many to many from a join problem, from a join point of view, isn't as efficient as a normal join. But the number of rows in this account map is like hundreds. It's not like, you know, millions. So the cost of a many-to-many join is kind of negligible, right? We don't see a lot of performance impact of that. I was due to try and do a blog to actually kind of measure it, but I haven't done that yet, right? So this is what our model kind of looks like, and I'll show you a demo of that, right? So if I go, now this is the final model that you can actually download, right? So if I go to tables here, you see I've got my general ledger, I've got my chart of accounts that actually come out of my ERP, so I haven't changed as much. I don't need these hierarchies anymore that I did before. I could probably delete those. I've got my many-to-many table and my financial report. And the end result is I get a profit and loss statement that looks like this table here. Just expand that out. So you can now see I've got it exactly as the accountants asked it to be in the requirements, including I've got sum at 2 levels, sum at 1 level, I've got subtotals, I've got running sums, and I've got these KPIs on there, right? And there's no DAX needed. The formula for the GL amount is just equals sum, right? Now, I might have had to deal with the ragged hierarchy, so I might have to multiply by a helper function to say, should it be null or not? Because for the IBITA, it's only a single level, it's not 2 level, right? But there's no DAX to do kind of running sum or anything like that. It's all handled by the data model, okay? Now, I'm probably going to need, the obvious question is, how do I build this map table from this range table? Because obviously the mapping table looks, it's a lot narrower and it's an expansion of that, right? It is a deterministic expansion, but it's an expansion of that, right? So I might show a demo of that. Now there's 2 ways of doing that. If you've got a SQL server underneath the Power BI, you could obviously, in a sort of T-SQL, run a use a stored procedure as a source, or build a fact table that actually has that there, right? But assuming that you're only in sort of Power BI, there's no SQL server underneath it, and you want to do this in Power Query, right? So you want to do some sort of data modeling work in Power Query. So let's do that, right? So here's my cash flow. I go into my transform data, and you'll see I bring in this account rules kind of table, right? So this is exactly as it is in the demo. For each line in the report, what are the ranges of the GL code that brings that in, right? I then create 3 hidden tables off that, right? I've got the core rules, which is just, it's a roll up, right? I've got the running sum rules and the custom aggregate rules, right? So core rules, just go on core. What I do is I use the base one as a source, okay? And then I add a custom column to expand this row out. So it's probably best to go to the advanced editor to show you the M code here, right? So when you've got a from and a to in M, you can expand that. So if this was 1 and 10, you'd get expanded out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in terms of rows, right? I then join the financial report onto that to say, well, what are the ones that I want to join into? And I also join on the chart of accounts, because I might expand this to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, but the chart of accounts might only use 4 of those, right? So I want to cut out rows that aren't used. And what I end up with, as I step through the code, you can see I get the expansion. I join on the financial report to give me what type of calculation, because I only want the sums, and then I join on the account code, and then I end up with this expanded view. Now the running sum is exactly the same process, but one subtle difference. In the core sum, I have a from and a to range, right? In the running sum, I'm going from the first line on the report to the current line on the report. So the expansion to create the many-to-many is expanding on that basis. It's not expanding on the kind of basis of the from and the to of the definition. And then what I'm doing is I'm copying in everything that was found on the account rules core for the ones that are matched. So the end result of the running sum is this hierarchy where I can say, right, if I was to just pick one of them, like 4, I don't know what running sum 4 is. It's probably the, well, cells. I can see there's 3 have to be totaled up. Whereas if I went to one that's very far down, say for example, went to 90, which is probably the final profit. No, let's pick 59. If we're lucky, that's probably EBITDA, right? You can see it's got to total up a lot of previous lines on the report in order to get that, because it's at the bottom of the report in terms of the running sum. But it's not a lot though. I mean, how many rows we've got? It's 31 rows. That's not, you know, it's not a lot for many to many. And then for the custom aggregates, what I'm doing is I'm doing the join, but based on a custom column, right? So I had this column calc1, and what I'm doing is I'm doing an inner join based on the calc1 column to find the matching rules. Just to show you, it'd probably be easier to show you on the, if I flip back to the, flip back to show you the, yeah, here's an example of a custom. You can see that what I've done is I've got this calc1 column as part of my table. So if I was to join the calc1 column onto the report heading, you could see I could get a one-to-many join to expand out to get the relevant child items. Now, that's only if you have custom aggregates, right? Okay. So once you get there, you've then got this structure. So if you pick only one thing from this kind of presentation, this concept of using a many-to-many to have a soft-coded reporting dimension is probably the key thing to try and kind of look at, right? And you're more than welcome to have a look at my example, right? If you're in the T-SQL land, life is a little bit easier, because in the T-SQL land, I'll just quickly show you the T-SQL land. Microsoft Management Studio. Let's open that up. My local instance, AdventureWorks. I think I created a stored procedure. So all that M code can be done in exactly the same way in T-SQL, but in T-SQL is infinitely easier, because in T-SQL, joins between entities or tables have a between clause. So when you have a from and a to range, joining two tables based on a from and a to is kind of native, right? M, as far as I know, doesn't really have that. So we have to go through the expand join thing. I think I saw on the connect item, certainly in tabular models, asking for a between join, but I've never heard of it.
I just need to say, I knew it. T-SQL is better. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the basic and the running sum code in T-SQL and compare that to the M code, you know, I personally find this easier to work with. But you've then got to pay for the licensing and the platform and everything else, right? So, you know.
Yeah, but I guess for this purpose, an Express edition would be just fine. You just need somewhere to put it.
Yeah. So I have to say that virtually all our projects, we're dealing with enterprise data warehouses, and we do have a T-SQL underneath that. But for the sake of the presentation, if anyone did just have a pure Power BI and it's going straight from the accounts package into Power BI, then it can be done in M. You know. Okay, so let's have a look at. So far, one thing that you probably find is unusual is how much DAX have we written to produce a fairly sophisticated financial report? Almost none, right? And the fastest DAX on the planet is DAX that doesn't exist, right? So it's all done by the storage engine so far, right? Now, where we do need DAX is obviously depending on the model, but in AdventureWorks, they do the newbie mistake of putting the budget in the general ledger, and they have this thing called a scenario. So some of the postings are budget and some are actual. I say the newbie mistake because no commercial accounts package would really do that, because budgets are typically stored at a separate grain. So they usually have a separate budget kind of table, but also throwing lots of different things in one table, you know, performance wise, it wouldn't be the best on the ERP, right? So it's not common. Well, certainly in most of the ERPs I've worked with, like, you know, we don't see that. It's a separate table. But if it is in the same table, we can slice that out by just having a calculate function. So we now have an actual and a budget, even though the base amount could be either, right? Which is fairly trivial, right? Now, where you do definitely need DAX is if you're dealing with balance sheet, right? So let's have a little chat about balance sheet, and I'll also show you a demo of what I mean by report versioning, which is a key benefit of this, putting the report into metadata, right? The difference between the profit and loss and the balance sheet is the profit and loss is showing you the movement in the period, like, you know, how much sales have I made in this month, right? The balance sheet is like saying, well, how many assets, you know, how many cars do I own over all time? It's not, you know, how many cars have I bought in this month, right? So, and it very much depends on how sophisticated the ERP is, right? AdventureWorks are obviously not very sophisticated at all, right? The only way that you can get the balance is by summing up over all time the entries in the general ledger. So here we have an opening balance formula that you would have in DAX. Most of your balance sheet is going to be based on the closing balance, right? So here's the similar closing balance, right? So it's not the most complex DAX, right? Now I have to say it usually gets a little bit more complex because no major ERP is going to do this type of stuff, right? For a variety of reasons. One is, imagine you've had your ERP for 20 years, right? Well, having to sum up all of the transactions over 20 years to get your balance sheet is, you might get a performance here, right? Not only in the BI model, but also on the reports they show internally within the ERP, right? So most ERPs would have some sort of snapshot table. So they'd have either a current snapshot, so every month they actually have a balance table, or they might have a yearly snapshot where at the start of the year they have opening balance as of the start of the year. So your DAX is a little bit more sophisticated because it's got to find the opening balance for the year in question, and then the running sum from the first month of the year to the current date. That's probably more common. The other reason ERPs would never do a running sum over all time is corruption, right? ERPs run on database engines with people messing with them, and often old postings actually get lost and corrupted. So if you had to generate your current set of accounts on the assumption that accounts 20 years ago were perfect, that would actually break down, right? Believe it or not. So account systems aren't as integral as you'd think when it comes to history, right? That's certainly my experience anyway. So that's how to do. So let's show you a demo of the balance sheet, right? So the balance sheet, let's go back to the reports, uses the exact same structure as the, oh, I didn't realize I made some changes. Whoops. I probably shouldn't have made changes because I probably filtered saying I messed it up now. What have I done? Let's hope it's still good. Okay, I think it's still good. Yeah, okay, it's still good. I haven't broken it. So here's the example of the kind of balance sheet. The only difference between this is the measure used is closing balance, if you see this. And if you look at the formula for closing balance, just here on screen, you'll see it's that exact formula. I'm showing the GL amount that would be shown on the sort of profit and loss, but I'm just sort of doing that overall time to show the closing balance. Now, usually for one of our commercial customers, it's a little bit more complex because you've also got the problem of currency conversion, right? your assets are going to be valued at the closing exchange rate value, not the exchange rate value at the time they were bought, right? So there's a bit of work, whereas the profit and loss currency conversion is going to be based on the closing balance at that month, or it could be at the time of the transaction, dependent on their rules. So here's our profit and loss, and it's split like this, right? This particular report here, they've got non-current assets, current assets, and then they've got some kind of liabilities, right? Creditors, so short term, right? And that gives us net current assets, right? Which I guess is that minus that, right? Then we have total assets less current kind of liabilities, so that would be a running sum, long-term kind of liabilities, and that gives us the net assets, which we compare to the total equity, and obviously the net assets minus the total equity is equal to 0, right? Now, this is only one format, right? Accountants will argue for years as to what the layout of this report should be. And if you work on systems that are multi-country with multiple regulations or multiple divisions like manufacturing versus procurement versus quality versus finance, they might have a different view on what a current asset is, right? One guy's current asset is another guy's, you know, could be a non-current asset, right? So as an example of that, like I work in IT, and I nearly buy a laptop every year or two, right? But certainly, so when we first did our accountants, they were like, well, that's a fixed asset. It's got to be written off over 5 years. And I was like, there's no frigging way this laptop's going to last 5 years. I want it written off over 1 year. So it's a different type of asset in the account. So imagine you've had that discussion, and within the customer, they want 2 different versions of the report. Well, that's quite easy to do, because what you do is you go to the metadata, duplicate it, and then and I'll show you an example of the spreadsheet. I actually did this on a spreadsheet just to demonstrate loading, right? So I'm just going to show you the spreadsheet and how we did that. So here's the files. I think account range is the table. Yeah, here we go. No, that's not the right one, because it's only got profit and loss on it. Try this one, account range. Here we go, right? So what I did is I took the balance sheet. Here's the definition of balance sheet. Copy, paste, change the report name to balance sheet 2, and then reorder all the report sections into a different style of report. So now within Power BI, I can go balance sheet 2, and I get a completely different way of doing it. Current assets and non-current are just called kind of fixed assets, right? Fixed assets minus liabilities and equity equal the same, right? So you can see there's a radically different kind of layout, but I can switch between the layouts. We can also use this for versioning. Say, for example, they say, well, this format of the profit and loss is the one that we're currently using, but from the 1st of January, we want a new version of the profit and loss. Well, you can have both of them within your BI kind of system and a toggle switch to switch between them. Or you might have a region based where people from one region want one style, people from another region want another style. So this, I love this kind of feature of having multiple versions of the same report there. So that's what we just discussed, report versioning. And as you see, it's the exact same values. Like if you look at any one entry, it's the same, but it's just kind of laid out from a reporting view in a different structure. Now, the last thing that I was going to chat about is empowering Excel kind of users, right? So you go to all of the effort of creating a Power BI version of the pro forma profit and loss, right? You add a little bit of interactivity. So, for example, I can click on EBITDA and I get a waterfall chart to show me the variance analysis. So I can see that Germany's actually performing quite badly, even though overall it's good, and I can see the breakdown. I can right click and do drill through analytics to say, well, show me that by department. I can do things like, we have a thing called a data explorer, so I can select the amount of the earnings before interest and tax, and I can break that down by, or probably not account, probably want to break that down by department, see what departments get in the month, break that down by country. So USA research department is making us the most money, and then I can break that down by account. Right, so you can add all of the analytics and the visualizations. Can anyone guess the first question that a financial accountant is going to see after he gets this report on the web version?
How can I get this into Excel?
Yeah, exactly, right. Either how can I get this into Excel is the first one, but they probably want an interactive version in Excel as well, so they can do slice and dice in Excel, right? So if you design your hierarchy correctly, right? So here's my web version of it there, right? Let's go to my profit and loss. I can, with a few clicks of the mouse, hopefully, I can put it into Excel. So if I analyze in Excel, oh yeah, this has changed recently. It used to download an ODC file, and now it downloads a starting spreadsheet. I mean, it's much the same, right? But did notice it changed a short while ago. Right, so here I've now got a pivot table, and let's count the number of drags of the mouse to get a pro forma balance sheet report. So I want my general ledger amount. I select the filters I want, right? So that's one drag on the mouse. Now on my filters, I'm going to want a particular, let's drag the fiscal calendar on. That's my second kind of drag on the mouse, and let's show for 2011. Yes, it's show for 2011, right? And then I'm going to need to go to my reporting hierarchy to say what report I want. Yeah, so that's my third drag on the mouse to say, hey, I want to have the profit and loss as opposed to the balance sheet. And then I drag my hierarchy on, and I might want to, I think up to 4 drags the mouse, so, and the fifth one is I might expand it. Now what you'll see is if you compare that to Power BI, that's now the exact same format, and I would get the exact same kind of numbers if I had the same kind of filter criteria. But here they can now do the slice and dice analytics that they like. So for example, I could put the month on the columns to get a breakdown by month. I might want to get a breakdown by department, organization. I get a breakdown by organization. That's another hierarchy, right? So some accountants might be more comfortable doing their analytics in here. We love to get them into Power BI, but at least we got the model in Power BI at this point, right? And the exact same format for them, which is what they're looking for. So that's in Power and Excel. The art is to have this sort of financial report table that's a soft coded of each of the rows needed on the report. Okay, so that's, I think, is everything I want to show content wise. Yeah, there's a summary. So what benefits of this sort of metadata driven approach? Obviously less kind of DAX. I mean, you know, who likes writing DAX? And you can change the rules outside of Power BI in your rules table, be it a spreadsheet or a SQL table or wherever the rules are stored. It's easy to change. You can support, you know, KPIs, running sums, custom operators, and you can have hierarchies with sort of drill down, multiple reports and versioning, you know. So these are sort of kind of benefits, but for me, it's the simplicity and elegance of doing as much as possible in the sort of data model. Okay, thank you very much, folks. I have some links here. I can email you a copy of the deck. I dropped into the chat this link because this is the most common thing it's asked for. Can I get a copy of the PBIX, right? So I put into the chat a copy of the PBIX. Feel free to download that, and I'll email you, Magnus, a copy of the presentation as well. So. Perfect. that's probably the best way to get sort of started. Is it's much easier to sort of hack away at the finished product actually, rather than try and do it from scratch, right?
Yeah, and then you can always, I mean, in probably tomorrow or Sunday, the recording will be up, so you can go back to it and look at a section if there is something you need repeated. So.
Yep, there is a follow-on report that looking at cash flow analytics, which are slightly different and kind of follows on. I think I delivered that talk, and there's a recording up for there's a website that Rishi, who's an MVP, runs called powerplatformfinance.com. So that's so if you look at the profit and loss and you're wondering what the kind of next kind of level on, I'd say cash flow is probably the next thing to look at there.
Cool.
Excellent.
Really, really good. And I mean, I never worked with Power BI myself, so I'm always impressed by seeing how fast you can do things. But it's really good to get a walkthrough of the actual thoughts behind it, because it as always, visualizations comes last. You got to figure out what you want to show first. So thank you for doing this. It was really thoughtful and useful, I'm sure, for many of us.
Okay, so if you have any, I imagine hopefully that's kind of self-explanatory enough, but if anyone does have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. No problems there. And as you said, there is the link there as well. So work away on that, sort of hacking away on that.
I don't see the link in the chat actually.
Hi folks, hold on. I'm gonna repost it. There you go.
Oh, there it is. Perfect. Awesome. Then well, if I get the presentation, I'll just upload it and I'll include the link to that one as well on the SQLfriday.net page for this session. That's where the video will be as well.
Okay.
Thanks for taking the time, Bob. It was really good.
That's great. Thanks so much. No, it's great to sort of break up the working day with a good talk, like, you know.
Yeah, and I'm gonna head into iteration retrospective starting now, actually. So I need to sign off. But thanks again. I hope we will bump into each other on an in-person event in the future.
Yes, that's the end of the year, maybe, if we're allowed in-person events by then. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd love to come to Dublin for well, it's not SQL Saturday anymore, but some kind of Saturday.
Yes, we'll be running a Data Cayley. It's a big virtual event, which is kind of the replacement of SQL Saturday, and that's going to be might be June or July this year, maybe, I think.
Cool.
But it will be a virtual event, though, obviously not in person yet.
Okay. Well, next year then.
Yeah. Yes, that's in 2022 for sure. Absolutely. Okay, that's great. Thanks a million. Right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Have a good rest of the day.